This is part 2, and here we're going to look at float. So the first part we looked at the box model and how we determine the width and the height of elements, but that's not the full picture in terms of positioning. In terms of positioning things, we need to look at floats. So what float does is it changes the way a block element is laid out by the browser. So let's look at how a block element is normally laid out. So normally the block elements just take up 100% of the width that's available to them if you don't write anything as we did before with the box model. So if I just write a plain old P element, in, so I just write, okay, P, and I have some stuff, and I have an H2 in here, and there's some stuff in there. They will both, the width of them will be determined by whatever the containing element width is. So if no width has ever been determined before, it's the full width of the page. They'll go all the way across. If you gave, let's say, a width to your body, like that, then it would be the width of that body. So whatever they're inside of, they take up that width. That's what's meant by the default width. So I put in a containing element like this here, and so then they fill up the width of that containing element. Now, if I just set the width of these directly, so here we go, on this one we've directly set the width of these blocks, right? So we have a different block 1, block 2, block 3. What they'll do then is just fit that width, but they'll also be all moved to the next line. So I forgot to fully mention in the previous one that in addition to getting the width of the containing element, also the other thing that block level elements do by default is they force the next one underneath them, regardless of whether they're a full width or not. So it sort of says, okay, when you're laying me out, I'm a block level element, so the next element comes, after me on the page below me. And so if you just set the width of things, then that's great. They'll still line up like this. They'll just won't be as wide. Okay, so when we add float to them, so here in our CSS, we've added float to each one of these blocks. So the HTML, by the way, hasn't changed, right? They're all still just block 1, block 2, block 3, but adding float means now, if there's room after this one is done, so this one is here, if there's room, the next one, instead of being down here, will sort of float up there. And then if there's room for the next block level element after that, which would have normally been here, it will also float up into position there. So that's sort of what floats do, and this is what allows us in, let's say, a grid layout to make columns, essentially. Right? So we float these things and give them specific widths so we get our columns in there. And if you're not using a grid system like the 960 grid, you can still use this stuff to do layout. Because you can have a normal block level element, let's say that's like a header and a footer, and then you might have content in here that you've defined widths for and floats and done that. Now to get the space actually like I have in here, you would have to use margin. Right, so I didn't write that down in the CSS here, but block 1 would have something like margin right of 20 pixels or something like that. Otherwise, this other one would be right up next to it, and the box would just be right there. Okay, so that's what float does really. Now, one of the things that happens here is that if you have a containing element around them, the height is gone. So, excuse me. Oops, I went down to the next one by accident. Okay, so let's say I had here just a div that was around all these, and so that would be a containing element. It contains those other divs inside. This div here wouldn't have any kind of height to it, because once these are floated, they move out of the normal way of rendering things, and so this div doesn't recognize them. So it would keep its width, but it wouldn't think it had any height to it. And we're going to look later on about how to deal with that. The other part about float is that if you keep adding them, so let's say I added a fourth div here, so here's a fourth one. If this was the defined width of my page, there wouldn't be enough width to put it, so it just naturally comes down to the next level here. So I could add hundreds of these, and they would just keep, if they're all the same 200 pixel width, coming out 3 across at a time like that. Right, so the floated elements just try to float up, but if they can't, they go to the next line still. Okay. So now let's look at another part. So let's say I increase the width of one of these. So we increased this width to 400 pixels on block 1. Right, that gave it 400 pixels for block 1. Now there's only enough room for one of these left, so that block 2 will still go there, and then block 3 says, oh, right, and it moves itself down to the next row, and block 4 goes next to it. So they kind of just reorder themselves like that. If I decrease this width, I might be able to fit the other one up there, and so forth. So increasing and decreasing the widths will affect the other floated elements if you increase one of them. Now, the other thing you can do with floats is you can force the next element to go to a new line, essentially, by using the clear property. So in this case, clear left has been applied to block 2, which is here. So instead of being where it normally would be, which is right there, because it's been cleared, it moves down to the next line. And so that's what clearing does. And if it's float left, clearing left clears it. Float right would clear a float right. Sorry, clear right would clear a float right. And if you're not sure or you want to just be safe, you can also write clear both, and that would clear it whether it was floated left or right. Okay. So, excuse me. Let's get back to that containing element problem. So we had that issue where if we had a containing element, like a div here, it wouldn't recognize the floated elements inside of it, so it thought it had no height. Right? It's like, well, I have no content, so I don't have any height, so I'll just be this little line instead of doing what you want it often to do, which is, fill out here and wrap around these. Now, if you don't use a background color on this containing element or anything like that, or background image, it might not even be a problem to you. Might not worry about it. But if you wanted, for some reason, and this is very common, so let's say have a solid background color behind all these different elements here. These were some different callouts, and you wanted a background color behind all of them. Then you'd want to give that background color to this containing element, and you want it to be the right height. So this is how to fix that. And there's actually more than one way to do it. So one of them is using a clearing div, and this is the one I used for the most part with you all in a midterm, which is showing here you had your containing class. This often had something like whatever it was applied to it, and then these block level elements often were the grid ones, right? So this had grid 4 or grid 2 or whatever inside of it. So then what you would do is you would just add this one here, this div with a class of clearing that would have nothing in it, right? These usually had something in it, but this didn't have anything in it. And that clearing class essentially just had this style applied to it that said clear both. So here we go right here. We put a clear in here that says clear both, and so now this element has no float applied to it, and it clears off the other floats. And the effect that has is that tells now the containing element now all of a sudden says, oh, I see I have at least one element, I have this clearing element, and it's all the way down here, so I need to expand myself to fit that clearing element. So it's still not really seeing these other elements, but it's seeing the cleared element underneath them, and so it expands itself to fit those. And so it grows to fit that content. Now the other one is that if you add an overflow property to the containing element, it will also expand to fit its content. So it's a nice little trick. And so what's been done here is this is my containing element, has a class of containing, and here we've added this overflow hidden to it. And that would, again, make it expand itself to fit its content. And this is, I think, becoming much more in vogue now than the clearing divs. Clearing divs used to be really popular, and they're fairly straightforward. You can see what's going on, but it adds some markup that you don't need to. And so this overflow one does it. Now there's some issues with the overflow, and I don't want to get into all of them right now. Because there's different types of overflow. So overflow hidden means if there is for some reason this content goes off over it, it just cuts it off. You can't see it. There's overflow scroll or auto, which would add scroll bars, which usually you don't want to do. You don't want to get a scroll bar all of a sudden in the middle, although sometimes you do want those. And there's different ways. But that's just another way that you have of now making this div containing element fit the content that's inside of it.